warm welcome to Inside Asia, a podcast by SEB about Asian economies and financial markets and their impact on financial investors and companies in Northern Europe. My name is Fredrik Hähnel. I am head of Asia for SEB and general manager of SEB in Singapore. We are recording this pod on the 18th of January in the afternoon, local time here in Singapore, as well as Shanghai, where we're broadcasting from. And we're just a few days away from celebrating the Chinese Lunar New Year and the beginning of the Year of the Rabbit, an animal that in Chinese culture is a symbol of peace and prosperity, which is, of course, promising for 2023 and something we need more of. But the rabbit is also believed to be vigilant, quick-minded, and ingenious. With us today as our guest, we have Juliette Lascoux, who is our new general manager for SEB in Shanghai, and one of the people that I usually speak to when I want to get a bit deeper insight into China beyond the usual analysis by economists. So first of all, hi Juliette and welcome to the show.
Hi Fredrik, thank you for inviting me.
And also, of course, welcome to my fellow podcast partner, Yokota, head of markets for SEB in Asia.
Hi Fredrik. Hi Juliette. Thanks for coming on.
Hi.
Sean, before we turn to Juliette, any observation in the Asian markets in the last month or so that you'd like to share with us?
Sure. It's purely about China assets and how well they're doing because China's opening up. So we're about 18 days into the year, and Chinese equities, if it's Hong Kong, whichever, they're up 7 to 9%, including the currency that's doing well. And so now it's a matter of how much of the good news is priced in. So are all the good news priced in, or are there more to come? And because the way China policymaking is designed, China tends to surprise on both on the up and downside. So as we're going to get good news, I think there's going to be more of it coming, and it's going to surprise on the upside. So I think it's not 100% baked in, so we'll get better Chinese asset markets this year. What about you, Fredrik? Any observations?
Yeah, well, I was in Indonesia over Christmas for a very short holiday, and just a small observation. It was striking how European and Western tourists are now back in full. But because of the lack of Chinese tourists, I don't think I saw a single Chinese tourist during that entire 5 days I was there. But because of that, I got a feeling that hotels are still not at full capacity. I would say they're at around maybe 60, 70%. But that's, of course, something that will soon change, as we soon will see a very large change and almost a tsunami of Chinese tourists starting to travel in the region and other parts of the world. And that is something that we'll get back to in a little while when we talk about China post-COVID. But now to our guests of today, Juliette. And Juliette, before we start our discussion on China, would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about yourself? You have quite an interesting background, I think, that really gives you a unique perspective on things, being a combination of Chinese, Swedish, French. And so if we start from the very beginning, you were born and grew up in Nanjing in China, north of Shanghai, but you moved to Sweden as one of an extremely small group of Chinese students being granted permissions to study abroad. If I remember, it's in the early 80s or so. You have to tell us. But why Sweden?
That's a good question. But let me start by correcting you. That wasn't in the early 80s that I belonged to that group of selected people who got the chance of going abroad to study. Well, I did grow up during the Cultural Revolution. I mean, the 1970s in Nanjing in China. But I belong to the generation that has benefited tremendously from the open and reform era, which started in the beginning of 1980s. So by the time I got the culture exchange scholarship, it was already at the end of the 80s. I got a chance, a offer to study in Sweden, a country I knew nothing about. And I knew briefly where it is. And I remember actually the only thing I knew about was that the Swedish Prime Minister was Olof Palme. He was murdered. But otherwise, the country is supposed to be a prosperous country and stable, etc. So I benefited from a bigger, benign environment, and I'm very thankful to the leadership at that time. So that was the story. Then I met my French husband in Sweden. that was just that was not planned, to say the least. That was just like that. It happened, and then life took another turn, and we stayed. We both stayed in Sweden. We got settled in Sweden and started to work for SEB. So by last year, I realized that I have lived more years outside of China than in China. So now here I am in China, back to China again. I guess it's not so interesting, but the only thing is that my background is a kind of mixed. And that's probably something of that era also.
And coming back wasn't so easy, right? You were appointed general manager to start in September, but you were stuck in Europe for several months due to China's strict COVID rules. And when you were finally allowed in early November, I think it was, you were quarantined for a week, and then you got out. And then just a few weeks later, China gave up on its 3-year-long extreme isolation under the zero COVID policy, which in turn led to chaos. So that leads us to the first question, or the first thing we would like to talk about here today is, of course, what is the situation right now in China? And I'm thinking of life in general, hospital capacity, the situation in the office, etc.
I think my feeling right now is that we are really at the tail of a protracted post-surge state, I would call it, longer than expected. As you said, there was a surge where 80% of Shanghai got infected and 84% of the staff at our office got infected pretty much at the same time within a period of 10 days. But now you wouldn't even think that that has happened for not so long time ago because the streets are almost full of people. Well, now it's getting empty because of the Chinese New Year. But otherwise, we are pretty much from the surface back to normal. Restaurants are full of people, public transportation is almost close to full capacity, traffic congestion is there. But I would say what is different is that COVID is still pretty much around, that people are still thinking about COVID, talking about COVID, taking consequences of COVID because their elderly relatives, parents were actually sick. So hospital sick after COVID. So this state of post-surge is really longer than expected. Hospital is full and the emergency departments at hospital are very much under stress. So I think we see the light at the end of the tunnel, I would say, but we're not quite there yet.
Could you just tell or give us your thoughts on why Xi Jinping and the leadership so suddenly changed the policy in such an extreme and unexpected way? There's so many theories around. Some of the more common ones are, for example, that when Foxconn decided to move production so clearly out of China to Vietnam and India, that kind of was a warning signal for China. Others say that they just lost control of the city of Beijing to COVID, and there was no way back to sort of lock down the city again because the criticism and the protests were so strong after the lockdowns in Shanghai. Others say that Xi Jinping, after he traveled to Bali for the G20 meeting, he saw in Indonesia and the rest of the world how things had normalized, and that was kind of a signal for him. But what are your thoughts on this?
My personal thought, and also I think for us who live in China, who have gone through that, the feeling is that it doesn't look like a planned accelerated exit, because we all know that at the end of October, November, the slogan was still pretty much zero COVID, right? That this is that was best for China. So that was very clear. So it came as a surprise. I would say that it felt more like a unplanned, but somehow a collapse of the of a zero COVID regime, which could not be held anymore because of the spread, the factor spread in Beijing. Also because the economy, the deteriorating economy was getting more and more clear. But I think the other factors could have played a role also. The Foxconn, the protests in November, where Chinese people expressed their dissatisfaction, and maybe also the foreign visits by the leadership, which somehow made an impression that the rest of the world was really in another state, right? So I think all these factors could have played in, but it wasn't a planned exit, and that was it was very chaotic, and there was not even basic provision of, for instance, fever reducers or basic medicines. So the public dissatisfaction is pretty high for that way of exiting, and that's a high price to pay politically. So, but if I have to pick one of the factors of all these, I would still say it's the economy, stupid.
Right, and that leads us to the economy. What do you think is going to be the gaining sectors in this, and what parts will not be so affected?
I think from China, from here on the ground, the feeling is that the first sector that will bounce back fast, that's consumer spending, sectors which related to consumer spending, restaurants, tourism, etc. That's almost mechanical because simply because the activities which were not allowed to be there are there. People are back to restaurants, and people are still are starting to travel back to their home to celebrate the Chinese New Year. So it has to come back. That is almost a given. The second sector, if you want to call it, that people somewhat bet a little bit on is the real estate, because rhetorically, real estate is now recognized by the government as the pillar of the economy. And the political signal is very, very important in China, as you know, and very, very clear. So, with that, I think we were in the banks in Shanghai were in a meeting with the central bank where we got signals from the central bank on how banks should act this year going forward. And it is very, very clear that it's an encouragement, conditionless, to lending towards all the sectors, to real estate, to consumer sectors, to ensure that the economy gets the credit support. So I see these two as the major. That coincides with what we saw in China Financial Index last year before the zero COVID policy was scrapped. And there, our clients' three most or highest concerns are actually disruption in supply chain, demand, and zero COVID. So I think these three things basically point out at once zero COVID is away, activities in these areas will bounce back. So I think that's where my sort of anecdotal casual observation or the feel on the ground.
The real estate sector that you mentioned is something that we've discussed quite a bit on this podcast before, Sean and I, of course. Where of course, the problems will still remain, but it's a matter of short term. Maybe there will be a boost and support for that sector, of course, and there are different numbers on how important it is to the Chinese economy. Some say it stands for some 25 to 30% of the economy, so it's of course a very, very important sector. But if I turn to you now, Sean, to also elaborate a little bit on this question, and how much of a game changer the opening up of China actually is for the world, now that the Western world is slowing, and who will gain in this massive rebound that everyone is expecting now. And of course, tourism is obvious. Chinese used to spend $250 billion per year on tourism abroad before COVID. And there are many anecdotal, interesting data points here, and I'll just mention one here. There are today, or at least recently, there were 14 daily flights to Thailand from China, 1-4. But before COVID, it was 200. And a third of foreign tourists in Tokyo before COVID were from China. So that's very obvious. But who else will gain? I mean, consumption of products. It's been there during COVID, but not services as well. And
Yeah, when China does that well, there are usually two winners. One is emerging markets, and then second, and within emerging markets, Asia benefits. And so with emerging markets, the Chinese consumption coming back is a big help, Chinese demand going up. And so it might be more concentrated on services, but when services do well, these people get jobs and they get higher incomes, and then they spend on goods as well. So total demand goes up together. And what Juliet mentioned about real estate, that's always going to be good for commodity prices, which emerging markets provide. And you're seeing that already with commodity prices starting to go up. So emerging markets do well, and they're also helped not just by Chinese demand, but with Fed ending or getting close to its rate hike cycle, dollar funding rates get relaxed, and emerging markets get help from that as well. So within Asia, of course, the tourism thing helps, but Asia is very trade oriented. It's heavily integrated. And so when one of these integrated states, the biggest one like China, starts to do well, the entire system improves. So I think Asia is the closest, most reliant, and benefits the most. So I think the question is really like not the direction, but how long this is going to last. Because there's a clear intention by policymakers to push things higher. So I think it's going to keep going um, until, like everybody else, like in the U.S. and Europe, until inflation hits. But I think we're still early days, so I think at least until the fourth quarter of this year, we're still safe until the tightening comes.
Elena, we had the party congress this autumn where Xi Jinping consolidated his power. He made appointments to the Politburo Standing Committee, etc. And we have the upcoming National People's Congress in March, where a lot of the appointments in the administration will be made. Among others, of course, the new prime minister, which most likely will be Li Chang, who was the party secretary in Shanghai uh, recently and was appointed number 2 in the Politburo Standing Committee at the party congress at the end of last year. So, of course, in this National People's Congress, we will also get more further hints on where things are heading in China and what the goals are for the economy and so on and so forth. Uh, Juliette, I mean, Xi Jinping, everyone talks about him consolidating power at the party congress and now being surrounded by loyalists. But people also, I think, say in general that many of those appointments were quite competent politicians. And now with China facing very large challenges with a damaged economy from the zero COVID years, a very leveraged economy, a troubled SOE sector, the state-owned enterprises, a property sector that is in quite deep trouble that we just talked a little bit about. Many people say that China is in reality in desperate needs of reform. And some people say that because she has now consolidated the power and because his team is competent, there's a good chance to take many difficult decisions, while others say that the risks are high now with too much power in the hands of one man and a small group, and therefore they're at risk of increasingly making mistakes. What camp are you in?
Yeah, it's difficult to choose. I think both camps have their points, and and there is a risk indeed in that power is consolidated, and if a wrong decision is to be made, it will be executed very efficiently. So I see points in both camps. But if I have to choose one, I'd still choose to give the new team the benefit of doubt, because first of all, it is a team that consists of quite some competent technocrats, judging from the background, of course. And as you said, the second thing, more important, is that they just got handpicked by the leader. So the team is newly formed, and there is reason to believe that they are still very united, which means that if these competent technocrats are capable of making competent decisions, those competent decisions will be carried out rapidly and efficiently. So if one is rational, then you could put a bet on giving them the chance.
What about you, Frederick? Are you a glass half empty or half full person on this reforms?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, of course. There's so little transparency, and still we don't know so much about this new administration. But I would say that I see very clear signals that it's all pro growth now. Like everything you read, everything they say, everything they write, everything right now is only about economic growth. And a lot of analysts around the world are a little bit surprised by this. Oh, we thought that it would be more politics now, that Xi Jinping was, more political, etc. I never thought so. I didn't expect anything else because it's always been a party that ever since the opening up. Of China, that Juliette talked about earlier in the 80s and all that, it's always been pro-growth. That's sort of the raison d'être for the Communist Party in China in many ways. But I think that I don't see much sign. So this is the old playbook. You just go all in. You start to stimulate the economy. You bail out the property companies if you need to, and you tell the banks to lend money. That's nothing new actually. Uh, but I think the big question will be whether they do reform. Will they reform the SOE sector? Will they reform the financial sector? Will they dare to continue to try to take action and improve the property sector, etc., etc. I don't really see that. I see that they're talking a lot about the tech companies, and we're done now with the punishment of tech companies, if you will. But at the same time, they're taking minority shares, the so-called golden shares in these tech companies, which tells me that they're still going to be very much involved, very much hands-on in the sector. So it remains to be seen. But so far I don't see any sort of signs of actually reforming China or addressing many of these long-term problems that have been there for quite a long time. But good. Let us move on a little bit also to talk about European companies or foreign companies, multinationals in general in China. And again, I turn back to you, Juliette. Because a lot of headquarters have been increasingly worried in the last few years about their supply chain dependency in China since it's been built up over so many years. And there has been, a lot of discussions on board level as to whether, should you really put all your all eggs in the China basket, or should you apply this China plus one strategy where you make your next investment in Asia somewhere else. A lot of companies are worried about China's alliance with Russia or this partnership that they formed just before just before Russia invaded Ukraine. There's been quite a lot of tension in the Taiwan Straits, as we all know. What do you hear from companies on the ground on these issues?
What I hear is that indeed China is at the top of the agenda of corporate board. That is for sure. Not for the same reason as previously, though. Now, I think for companies that have significant sales to China, the signal is they still want to stay in China for this gigantic market. The market is still very attractive for them. So what the companies want is to de-risk, to build a local supply chain as much as possible. So in that sense, to insulate China from their global supply chain. That is what usually people talk about when usually people talk about in China for China, is to make sure that you have a insulated local supply chain for the sales in China. You still want the money that you earn from China. So that's put it in a simple way. Now, for companies that source from China or produce in China, China is an important link in the global supply chain. There is a clear signal, and I think it's not only now. It started a few years ago of diversifying in order to de-risk, to reduce the dependency on China. And I think that trend has been reinforced during the pandemic period, when you saw how China was not synchronized with the rest of the world. And that created a lot of disruptions in the supply chain. So there, I think it's what people talk about China plus one. When people talk about this, about diverging part of the supply chain to Vietnam or Indonesia or India. And I met one company just last week where they have over 95% of sourcing from China. And he said that, well, it's easily said than done, because you can't do it overnight, and then the production efficiency in China is still superior in his particular industry, let's put it that way. So I think it is definitely a trend, and companies will certainly do, but a lot of local China CEOs also recognize the difficulties in carrying this plan out. So it's pretty much that. But nevertheless, this means that investments are taking a hit, because companies are moving into a wait and see mood, that it get hesitant. So things are kind of paused. And hopefully when senior management could travel to China more, some of the decisions got made either in China or not at all in China. Right now, it's a little bit of a wait and see mode, many CEOs confirm. Yeah, that's the local feel.
And before we leave this discussion on the economy, Sean, do you want to add anything related to business in China or or the economy as such?
Well, I think on the company side, I think even for Chinese companies, it's probably good for them to diversify as well. So I can see them moving out or moving to Southeast Asia, not to lose out the market share to the Western companies. So I think it's a foreign and a domestic company thing that's going to happen. But yeah, I think on top of that, the Chinese authorities need to kind of keep in mind about the capital flight risk when money starts to fly out. So I'm sure they want them to go, but at the same time, they'll try to control the pace, not to create another chaos.
Yeah, and we see that here in Singapore, right, Sean? A lot of Chinese moving in and investing. I heard a joke recently at a seminar I attended, where someone said that it's easier today to have a meeting with a Chinese billionaire in Singapore than in China. I don't know how true that is, but it maybe says something at least of what's going on here. I think it could be interesting to hear your view, Gillette, on a completely different subject. Um, China. I think what Mao Zedong said in the early days of the People's Republic, that women hold up half the sky, and there can of course be a lot of discussions on how much participation you have in politics by women today, and we could come back to that. But if you look at this from a business point of view, I read a very interesting statistics on China recently that said that China is today home to 2/3 of the world's self-made women billionaires. And the way you defined a billionaire is someone who did not, or self-made billionaire is someone who did not inherit the money from his or her parents. China had, I think it was last year, 78 female self-made billionaires, which is more than double the rest of the world combined. Uh, so China had 78, the US had 25, and India only had 3. And all of us who worked in China, you do see a lot of very successful business women in the industry in China. And I'd just like to hear your view, Juliette, coming back now from Sweden and Europe, just starting to work in China. Why do you think this is the case? Do you have any good explanations to why China, at least in this aspect and in certain aspects, relatively speaking, Chinese women have been more successful in business than many other countries?
Yeah, I don't think I have any explanation to that, but maybe I can share with you some of my observations and my reflections. I think when I grown up in the socialist era of 1970s, um, one thing is clear is that the government, the socialist government, the Chinese Communist Party, did provide the opportunity for women or girls, at least in cities, to have equal access to education. So that is, I think, quite fundamental. That paves the way for future developments, right? So that is something I saw, I experienced myself. Second thing I think is maybe in the political slogan, or it just take Chairman Mao's "Woman hold up half the sky," right? That is a very clear position taking from his side, and that is very important in China, as you know, the top leaders' position in this matter. And I think when I grown up, there was people are proud of being in a family of what we call double employees, meaning both dad and mom actually works. So it is, you are proud of living, one is proud of living on its own labor. And that was very much advocated by the Chinese Communist Party, that you shouldn't be a parasite. Well, we can discuss whether a housewife is a parasite, but that was pretty much the political wind at that time, that everyone should live on its own labor. So that may have created a value or a sentiment in the society. And all plus that girls are more used to see that their moms actually work in the cities again. I'm not quite sure it's the case in the countryside. Now, the third thing, I think we could maybe talk about the social structure in China, and actually, for that matter, in pretty much a large part of Asia, that you probably have, as a woman, you probably help from your family or extended family. Parents got retired after 50, often between 50 and 60, plenty of chance to offer help for their children. I mean, that played a role. So you got your household services provided. And in the earlier era, now I'm not talking about 1970s, I'm not even talking about 90s, I'm talking about 2000, then professional women could still purchase household services in the market for a not so high price. So that may have helped also. I don't say it's good. Today in Shanghai, household services is a lot more expensive than 10 years ago. So I don't think young girls today have advantages of that kind, but they still have access to their parents. So these are sort of a little bit of a reflections. So it could be a combination. China was poor, developing, and that create in that sort of environment, women could strive uh, to a larger extent than more matured economies or countries. Let's see whether China remains so going forward.
Sure, I don't think we can leave the subject without also looking at the political side of things here. Xi Jinping, as we just said, just announced in the autumn his new Politburo and Politburo Standing Committee, and there's not a single woman in the entire Politburo. It's 25 men in the Politburo, if I remember correctly, and all of them obviously men. I think also in the Central Committee there wasn't a very large proportion that were women. What is the reason for this? It looks to me quite unmodern in today's world that you run the country with politicians that are 100% men.
My reflection is rather that they did not make a quota system to force any woman in the Politburo. And that itself can mean something, of course, but at least it's a fact that there's no quota system in place. And perhaps also the focus of the government at this point of time was less on the gender equality, but rather on a united leadership, united on opinions or on loyalty or on other criteria. So simply it was less prioritized factor rather than systematically or purposefully to exclude women in Politburo. That's my guess, of course.
We're trying in this podcast to not only talk about the obvious things like the macroeconomy, but also other aspects of the region. So I thought it was an interesting subject. And any comment from you, Sean?
Yeah, I think it's about diversity and opening up. I feel like economically, that's usually what's made China do well is when they open up and kind of have more diversity. That's when exports do well, or like tech sector do well. So yeah, I hope long term this thing changes. I think it's good for the Chinese economy as well. But yeah, I think those political decisions may hinder economic growth as well.
Very well. We are approaching the end of this podcast, but I just think that we have to ask one more question, and I just want to hear your short comment, both of you, on this, and start with you, Juliette. Taiwan. What do you expect during this year? It was, tensions were higher than ever before. We had, the visit of politicians, not only from the US but also from Europe and Japan, and very very strong reactions from China during the past year. We have an upcoming election of a new president early 2024 in Taiwan, and we start to see a little bit of preparations for that during this year, of course. What are your thoughts? How will this play out?
Thanks for limiting the time zone to 2000 timeline to 2023. And I think if you ask me about 2023, I am like most of the China CEOs here that we do not think there is a high risk of military conflict with Taiwan during this year. I think it's definitely it's a risk. Nobody knows. But I also saw in both media and social media a lot of emphasis on peaceful reunification with Taiwan, and the emphasis is pretty much on peaceful solution. So that's the local atmosphere at the moment, and everyone's talking about the economy and only the economy.
Yeah, I think personally it will very much depend on, of course, what the US does. If the US will provoke China and change the status quo in this conflict, I think that would be a reason for China to to also increase its pressure on Taiwan. As long as the status quo is maintained in short term, I also agree with Juliette that probably it will not escalate. But at any point, if the U.S. changes this and pushes Taiwan, or Taiwan itself would start to indicate that they are looking at declaring independence in any shape or form, I think that would be a trigger for things to turn worse. But I was just interested to hear your thoughts on this, Juliette, in particular, since you're reading the Chinese media and talk to people on the ground.
I totally agree with you. The US holds it also, indeed.
And I guess if the priority is the economy, last thing you want to do is start a conflict. So it kind of goes against it. And I guess, Juliette, also like on the Russia front, there's not much news locally as well.
I think there isn't much coverage really on that. The Chinese media is very different, and even social media is vastly different from the Western or European media. But it is not the top priority or concern of the little person on the street. That is for sure. And I think what I've seen in the Chinese media and social media lately is that it leaks out news about China actually did not know that Putin was going to launch such an invasion in February, etc. And I think it's purposeful leakage. It's like to spread the atmosphere that it wasn't so China's firmly on Russia's side. And judging from behavior, one could perhaps argue that China isn't 100% on Russia's side either. It tried to stay in the middle, but it did not put itself against Russia. That's a fact.
And with that, we have reached the end of this podcast. Thank you so much, Sean, for co-hosting the pod with me today.
Thanks, Fredrik.
And thank you so much, Juliette, for sharing your insights from the ground in China.
Thank you, Fredrik.
And we will be back with a new Inside Asia soon, so stay tuned. Happy New Year!
Happy New Year!